Imagine losing $180 billion.
Right. Just completely gone.
Yeah, but not in a market crash. Not in some spectacular corporate bankruptcy with empty office buildings.
No, just hiding it in plain sight. On a balance sheet.
Exactly. You construct this illusion of revenue that's so incredibly massive, it literally artificially inflates the national export data of the entire country.
It's wild. And you sustain this mirage for, what, 4 years?
4 years. Right under the noses of the apex financial regulators. I mean, it sounds like financial science fiction, but it's the exact reality currently paralyzing the highest echelons of our capital market.
It really forces a terrifying reevaluation of everything we assume about institutional oversight,
Oh, totally.
Because we operate under this, implicit psychological contract. We just assume the systems governing our lives are robust, fail-safe mechanisms.
Right, whether it's the statutory auditor verifying a corporate ledger, or, say, the fire inspector signing off on a hospital ward.
Or even the meteorological model predicting our food supply. We just trust the architecture.
But when you actually stress test that architecture, you find out we're attempting to run this hyper-complex 21st century economic engine on, a surprisingly fragile 20th century regulatory chassis.
It's a very fragile chassis.
Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive. This is the 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik.
Glad to be here.
If you're a dedicated aspirant listening to this, or just, an obsessive consumer of geopolitics and policy, you already know the headlines from June 5, 2026.
Yeah, you don't need a summary from us.
Exactly. You need the underlying mechanisms. You need to understand how these completely disparate events, from algorithmic pricing in aviation to the literal chemical realities of a hospital fire, how they interlock to define the current capacity of the Indian state.
Because, policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. A failure in municipal enforcement in a Tier 2 city operates on the exact same spectrum of state capacity as a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure standoff in the Andaman Sea.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start at the most visceral end of that spectrum, right? Physical safety.
Yeah.
We're looking at a tragedy that exposes a really catastrophic, cascading failure in urban governance. Early morning, June 4, Prasad Hospital in the Brahmpura area of Muzaffarpur, Bihar.
Right. A multi-story private healthcare facility.
Right. So at roughly 3:00 a.m., a fire ignites in the 5th floor intensive care unit. There are 27 patients inside, and 5 critically ill individuals are killed, basically entirely unable to escape.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
And we have to place this within the immediate temporal context, right?
Yeah.
Because this occurred a mere 24 hours after the Malviya Nagar hotel fire in Delhi.
The one that claimed 21 lives.
Exactly. And if you trace the data backward, you look at the government hospital in eastern India this past March, or the ESIC hospital in Ahmedabad back in 2022.
Or the Vijay Vallabh Hospital in Maharashtra in 2020.
Yes, the variables are almost perfectly static across all of them. It is invariably late at night.
Oh.
It is almost always an ICU. And the ignition source is overwhelmingly electrical.
I want to break down the physics and chemistry of why the ICU specifically acts as an accelerant. Because, we think of these spaces as sterile, hyper-controlled environments.
Which they are, medically speaking.
Medically, sure. But from an engineering standpoint, an ICU is essentially a high-density power grid combined with a pressurized gas distribution network.
That's a really good way to put it.
And at 3:00 a.m., human supervision is at its absolute lowest ratio, right? But the mechanical and electrical load is running at 100%.
Yeah, and that electrical load is the primary vector here. You've got life support monitors, mechanical ventilators, continuous positive airway pressure machines.
Basically everything keeping these people alive.
Right, and specialized thermal regulation beds. All of this is drawing massive amperage through wiring infrastructure that, especially in many of these retrofitted private facilities, was never actually designed for that specific load profile.
It's just too much current.
Way too much. But the true catalyst, right, the element that turns a localized electrical smolder into an instantaneous, unsurvivable flashover, is oxygen enrichment.
Right, because normal atmospheric air is, roughly 21% oxygen?
Exactly, 21%.
But in a fully occupied ICU, you have centralized medical oxygen being piped directly into dozens of wall units. It's running through nasal cannulas, ventilator circuits.
So you are inevitably dealing with microleaks in the ambient environment.
And in an enclosed, climate-controlled space like a fifth-floor ward, those microleaks accumulate over hours.
Precisely. The ambient oxygen saturation might drift up to 24 or 25%.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but chemically it's massive.
Right? It's huge. Because oxygen itself is not flammable.
Yeah.
But it drastically alters the chemistry of combustion around it. It lowers the ignition threshold of every single material in that room.
Wow. So things that wouldn't normally burn.
Exactly. Synthetic privacy curtains, plastic intravenous tubing, standard foam mattresses, materials that would normally just melt or maybe resist ignition suddenly become highly reactive fuel sources.
So when an aging breaker fails to trip, which happens all the time, and a spark jumps from an overloaded socket, it's hitting an atmosphere that is literally primed for explosive combustion.
And the evacuation calculus at that point is essentially zero.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just unplug a patient on a ventilator and carry them down 5 flights of stairs in a smoke-filled stairwell.
You cannot. A single critical patient often requires a synchronized team of maybe 3 to 4 medical professionals just to safely transition them to portable life support, let alone physically carry them out.
And at 3:00 a.m.
At 3:00 a.m., that manpower simply does not exist on the floor. Period.
Which brings us to the regulatory collapse, because it feels like a Swiss cheese model of disaster. Every layer of defense has a hole. How do so many regulations fail at once? The defense against this shouldn't be a heroic 3:00 a.m. evacuation.
No, it should be the physical infrastructure suppressing the fire before it spreads.
Exactly. But when you map the governance framework let's look at the Clinical Establishments Act of 2010. It's a central legislation dictating minimum infrastructural standards. But health is a state subject under the 7th schedule, right?
Right. And Bihar's compliance with these specific stringent safety mandates of that act has been, well, historically porous.
Porous is a polite word for it.
Yeah. We see facilities operating with pending fire, no objection certificates or NOCs. But the NOC itself has basically devolved from a rigorous engineering audit into a bureaucratic toll booth.
That is the core issue with the political economy of urban real estate here. An inspector signs off on the blueprints, which might show fire-rated doors and compartmentalized ventilation shafts.
Right, the blueprints always look perfect.
But during execution, the builder substitutes standard plywood doors to cut costs. They install decorative combustible cladding, and maybe they put in a sprinkler system, but it's never actually pressurized or connected to a reliable water matrix.
Or worse, the active suppression systems are deliberately disabled.
Wait, deliberately disabled? Why?
Oh, absolutely. Smoke detectors in these facilities often trigger false alarms due to minor dust or electrical anomalies. So instead of, fixing the calibration, hospital administrators frequently just switch the panel off entirely. They just want to avoid disturbing the patients.
That's terrifying.
It is. And there is no mandatory independent annual electrical safety audit strictly enforced by the Bureau of Indian Standards for these specific legacy structures.
And the enforcement math is completely broken anyway. If a state is operating with a ratio of roughly 1 fire safety inspector for every 500,000 citizens.
That's just common.
Right. Then proactive auditing is a physical impossibility. The state apparatus basically only arrives to count the bodies.
And that reactive posture fundamentally violates the preventative mandate of the Disaster Management Act of 2005. I mean, a hospital fire is not an act of God. It is a highly predictable, entirely man-made hazard. Furthermore, this touches the absolute core of constitutional jurisprudence. When a citizen is admitted to an intensive care unit, they surrender their physical autonomy to the institution.
Yeah, they have no agency left.
Exactly. And by extension, they surrender to the regulatory protection of the state. A failure to enforce basic structural safety is a catastrophic failure of Article 21, the right to life.
Which is exactly why the 19th Law Commission advocated so aggressively for a National Fire Services Act. And that was over a decade and a half ago.
And it was largely ignored.
Without a unified statutory framework that establishes binding minimum standards, mandatory third-party audits for buildings above 15 meters, and critically severe criminal liability for corporate management, not just the poor shift supervisor.
Right, the actual owners.
Yeah. Until you have that, the economic incentive to cut corners will always overpower the deterrent.
Totally. Until the cost of non-compliance structurally threatens the existence of the enterprise, this tragic cycle is just going to persist. The state lacks the granular capacity to police every ward, which means the architecture of accountability itself has to be rebuilt.
So that concept, the limits of state capacity to engineer and manage complex environments, brings us to a radically different theater.
A much larger one.
Much larger. We are moving from the failure to regulate urban infrastructure to the agonizing complexities of executing a monumental greenfield ambition. Let's examine the strategic and ecological standoff at the Great Nicobar Island.
This is arguably the most consequential multidimensional policy puzzle currently active in the Indian macroeconomic landscape.
It's massive.
It is. We are observing a direct collision between maritime grand strategy, sovereign capital allocation, and irreversible ecological restructuring.
And the revelation regarding the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund is what blows this wide open. The NIF is the government's own sovereign wealth fund, right? They manage tens of thousands of crores.
They are the ultimate financial pragmatists of the Indian state.
Exactly. And internal assessments indicate the NUF has raised severe red flags regarding the core viability of the International Container Transshipment Terminal, the ICTT, that's planned for Galathea Bay.
To really understand the weight of that dissent, you have to measure the scale of the holistic development plan pushed by NITI, Aayog, and Aniti 2.
Give us the numbers.
We are looking at a projected capital expenditure nearing 1 lakh crore rupees over a 30-year horizon.
100,000 crore.
Yes. The master plan essentially proposes dropping a hyper-modern metropolis onto one of the most isolated topographies on Earth.
The blueprint is genuinely staggering. A 14.2 million TEU transshipment terminal. A 3,300-meter dual-use military and civilian runway.
A massive power plant.
Right, a 450 MVA power generation facility, and a planned township designed to absorb 3.5 lakh residents.
Which effectively multiplies the island's current demographic footprint by a factor of 40.
It's a completely new city.
It is. And the official economic justification hinges heavily on the transshipment calculus. Currently, due to draft limitations and turnaround inefficiencies at our domestic ports, a massive volume of India-bound cargo is basically forced to dock at hubs like Colombo, Singapore, or Port Klang.
Because the big ships can't dock here.
Right. So the cargo is fractured onto smaller feeder vessels for the final leg to India, and that bleeds roughly $200 million annually in foreign exchange fees.
So the geographic argument is that Great Nicobar sits right on the edge of the primary east-west shipping lane. It's just a stone's throw from the Strait of Malacca, where nearly 100,000 vessels transit every year.
A massive choke point.
Yeah, so you build a deep draft port there,
Yeah.
and you theoretically siphon that transshipment traffic away from Sri Lanka and Singapore. Plus, you establish an impregnable naval overwatch right at the throat of the Malacca choke point.
Effectively countering any hostile maritime expansion in the Indo-Pacific.
Exactly. That is the theoretical dual-use synergy. But I have an original question here. If the NUF itself says it can't compete commercially with Singapore, and conservationists say the military airport is only like 5% of the land, what is the actual justification driving this?
Well, the NUF's financial skepticism targets the brutal reality of maritime logistics. You can't simply dredge a harbor, pour some concrete, and expect global shipping alliances to spontaneously reroute.
They have established routes.
Right. Singapore and Colombo possess decades of entrenched operational efficiency, frictionless customs clearing, and massive, deeply integrated hinterland connectivity. A standalone port in the Andaman Sea lacks that entire industrial hinterland ecosystem.
So if the sovereign fund itself doubts the terminal can aggressively outcompete established global hubs on a purely commercial basis, it fundamentally alters the justification for the ecological sacrifice being demanded.
And that sacrifice is apocalyptic for the local biosphere.
Apocalyptic is not an exaggeration here. We are talking about the diversion of over 130 square kilometers of primary tropical rainforest.
The felling of nearly 1 million mature trees in a hyper-endemic zone.
1 million trees.
Yeah. And the marine impact is even more severe. Galathea Bay is not just a beach. It is one of the most vital nesting sites on the planet for the globally vulnerable leatherback sea turtle.
Right. These are massive, ancient creatures.
We are dealing with an apex marine reptile that navigates thousands of miles of open ocean to nest on this specific topography.
And the dredging operations required to achieve the draft depth for those ultra-large container vessels will inevitably obliterate the surrounding coral reef ecosystems. It's going to alter the coastal hydrodynamics permanently.
And doing all this in a known, highly active seismic zone that was devastated by the 2004 tsunami. It feels like challenging geological realities.
But the most profound ethical and legal barrier lies with the human element, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because the interior of Great Nicobar is the sovereign domain of the Shantan. They are a particularly vulnerable tribal group, a PVTG. We're talking about roughly 300 individuals practicing a semi-nomadic, hunter-gatherer existence.
Yes, and they have maintained deliberate, centuries-long isolation from mainland civilization.
This is where the legal architecture of the Forest Rights Act of 2006 completely short-circuits. The law mandates free, prior, and informed consent before traditional forest lands can be diverted. But, and this is what I don't get, how do you structurally acquire informed consent for a 14 million TEU automated transshipment hub from an uncontacted civilization?
You can't. The conceptual gap is unbridgeable.
It's literally impossible to explain what a transshipment hub even is to them.
It is entirely unbridgeable. Introducing a population of 3.5 lakh construction workers, technicians, and residents onto the island creates an existential epidemiological and cultural threat to the Shumpin.
They have no immunity to our diseases.
None. The National Green Tribunal may have cleared the project, but environmental jurists argue it operates in direct contravention of the precautionary principle and the fundamental dignity protections established in recent constitutional jurisprudence.
It's the ultimate test of state priorities. The drive to secure a geostrategic anchor in the Indo-Pacific and stop hemorrhaging transshipment capital versus the permanent erasure of an ancient ecological and anthropological sanctuary.
It's a devastating trade-off.
And that friction between human intervention and environmental stability transitions us perfectly into a threat that isn't isolated to an island, but is currently hovering over the entire agrarian economy of the subcontinent. Let's analyze the delayed southwest monsoon and the terrifying atmospheric mechanics of the 2026 season.
The southwest monsoon is not merely a weather event. It is the ultimate arbiter of Indian macroeconomic stability.
It really dictates everything.
Everything. The timing, distribution, and volume of this precipitation dictate everything from rural demand and FMCG revenues to sovereign bond yields and inflation targeting at the RBI.
So, the India Meteorological Department officially declared the onset over Kerala on June 4. That is a 72-hour delay from the historical June 1st benchmark. Now, to a lay observer, a 3-day delay sounds statistically irrelevant. It sounds like a rounding error. Is this really a crisis or just normal weather variation?
In a vacuum, a 3-day delay is entirely benign. The IMD utilizes a highly rigorous multivariable matrix to declare the onset.
It's not just, oh, it's raining.
Not at all. It requires at least 60% of 14 designated stations in Kerala to register 2.5 millimeters of continuous rainfall.
Okay.
Alongside specific parameters for the depth of westerly winds in the lower troposphere and an outgoing long-wave radiation value dropping below 200 watts per square meter, which basically indicates deep convective cloud cover.
So the atmospheric mechanics finally aligned on June 4, but the markets aren't reacting to the 3-day delay itself, are they?
No, they are reacting to the danger combination.
Right, the overarching climatic architecture dominating the Pacific, specifically the rapid intensification of El Niño. Let's map out exactly how surface temperatures thousands of miles away in the Pacific physically starve the Indian landmass of water.
It's a massive disruption of global atmospheric circulation. Under neutral conditions, the trade winds blow west across the tropical Pacific, pushing warm surface water toward Indonesia and Australia.
And that drives immense convective rainfall.
Exactly. But during an El Niño event, those trade winds weaken or even reverse. The pool of warm water sloshes back eastward toward the coast of South America.
And when that heat source moves east, the entire Walker circulation loop shifts with it, right?
Yes. The ascending branch of moist, rising air moves away from the Indo-Pacific, leaving descending, high-pressure, dry air over our longitude. It fundamentally suffocates the monsoon trough.
Suffocates it. Historically, the correlation is pretty brutal.
Very brutal. The vast majority of intense El Niño years result in deficient rainfall over the Indian subcontinent. And the IMD's dynamic models project this specific El Niño anomaly to peak exactly during the critical secondary phase of the monsoon in August and September.
Which is why we usually rely so heavily on the Indian Ocean dipole as a counterbalance. If the western Indian Ocean near the Horn of Africa warms up faster than the eastern side, a positive IOD, it can supercharge evaporation and pump enough localized moisture toward the western Ghats to offset the El Niño drag.
Right. It's like our backup generator. But the critical vulnerability for 2026 is that the models indicate a strictly neutral IOD.
The backup generator is offline.
Completely offline. We are facing the full, unmitigated drag of the Pacific anomaly. The IMD is forecasting seasonal rainfall at a precarious 90% of the long-period average.
That's a distinctly deficient season, and the spatial distribution forecast is even more alarming. The monsoon core zone encompassing Vidarbha, Marathwada, central Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and parts of Karnataka is explicitly flagged for below normal precipitation.
This is the rain-fed heartland.
Right.
And this compression of the temporal window for the Kharif sowing season is dangerous. Crops like soybean, cotton, pulses, and paddy operate on strict photoperiods and moisture requirements.
They need water at very specific times.
Exactly. If the ground remains dry through late June, farmers either delay sowing, which crushes the eventual yield, or they shift to shorter duration, lower value, drought-resistant variants.
Which severely depresses rural household income.
Significantly. And the systemic shock absorbers are already depleted. We are looking at the 150 major reservoirs tracked by the Central Water Commission, sitting at roughly 17% of total live capacity.
17%. That is dismal.
It is. If the catchment areas in the core zone don't receive sustained heavy downpours, the hydroelectric generation capacity, which forms a vital baseload during peak summer demand, will crater.
And that cascades directly into the inflation data. We are already dealing with a volatile global supply chain. Elevated fertilizer inputs due to the geopolitical disruptions, like the Iran war supply disruption, are squeezing the farmers on the cost side.
Right. Input costs are soaring.
So if the output yields collapse due to moisture stress, the wholesale prices of pulses and cereals will spike aggressively, forcing the central bank to maintain a hawkish monetary stance far longer than anticipated.
It is a massive interlocking crisis of resource management.
And responding to a crisis of that magnitude, coordinating localized drought relief, releasing buffer stocks, precisely targeting welfare interventions, it requires an unimpeachable, hyper-granular data set of the population.
Which is incredibly difficult to gather.
Right, which brings us to the operational nightmare of the upcoming 16th census and the friction of digitizing the Indian state.
The 2027 census represents the most ambitious data-gathering exercise in human history. Phase 1, the house listing and housing census, involves the mobilization of over 30 lakh enumerators.
3 million people on the ground.
Yes. And these are not specialized data scientists. They are predominantly primary school teachers and local administrative staff drafted into this massive logistical machinery.
The paradigm shift here is the technology. India is transitioning to a fully digital-first census architecture. The Census Management and Monitoring System, the CMMS, requires enumerators to utilize specific mobile applications, capturing highly structured demographic data and syncing it with precise geospatial GPS tagging for every single domicile.
Furthermore, they have introduced the self-enumeration portal. Citizens can pre-populate their household data online and generate a unique alphanumeric code. The enumerator then acts as an auditor, arriving at the physical location to cross-verify the pre-submitted data against ground realities.
I mean, theoretically, it is a brilliant concept for reducing data entry latency.
In a sterile, high-bandwidth urban environment, perhaps.
Right. But when you deploy this software across the staggering topographical and infrastructural diversity of India, the execution is breaking down. The Hindu's editorial analysis highlights a severe crisis of data discrepancies, triggering endless loops of re-verification orders from the central command.
The back-end algorithms in the CMMS are strictly designed to flag anomalies. If an enumerator logs a household in a tribal block, but the GPS coordinates fail to ping accurately due to lack of satellite line of sight or dead cellular zones, the system rejects the entry.
It just kicks it back.
Yeah. Or if the interface, which is attempting to map over a dozen regional languages, causes a translation error in the data fields, the system flags a demographic mismatch.
And the administrative response hasn't been to patch the software or deploy technical support units to the field. It has been to issue punitive mandates, forcing the enumerators to return to the location and re-enter the data.
Which is incredibly frustrating for them.
It sounds like we're giving people who might not have great smartphones a highly technical job and then blaming them when the app crashes. Isn't that like blaming the postman for a badly written letter?
That's a perfect analogy. You take an exhausted school teacher who has just hiked 5 kilometers into an unmapped hamlet, and you tell them their work is invalid because the app's location API timed out.
You are creating a massive, perverse incentive structure.
Exactly. They aren't going to hike back. They are going to sit in their living rooms, override the location permissions, and template-fill plausible synthetic data just to satisfy the algorithm's formatting requirement to avoid scrutiny.
Oh, wow. So by attempting to enforce rigid algorithmic purity without accommodating the physical reality of the infrastructure, you inadvertently corrupt the entire data set.
The data goes underground,
Yeah.
the errors become synthetic and virtually undetectable.
It's the classic principal agent problem, exacerbated by bad UX. And the stakes of this data are existential for the political future of the country. This isn't just about counting toilets and televisions. This exact data set is the statutory foundation for the upcoming delimitation exercise.
Delimitation will fundamentally alter the distribution of parliamentary seats across states, shifting the center of gravity of political power.
Yeah, that's huge.
Furthermore, the operationalization of the Women's Reservation Act and the hypersensitive recalibration of OBC and subcategorized caste quotas all rely entirely on the absolute integrity of this digital count.
If the foundational data is compromised by software friction, the subsequent political architecture is built on sand.
The editorial rightly argues that accountability must be distributed. You need comprehensive technology audits of the CMMS portal, offline first app architecture that truly functions in zero connectivity zones, and supervisory analysis that identifies systemic software failures rather than blaming the end user.
Now, keeping with the theme of the state intervening to manage complex systems, let's pivot from the data economy to the aviation economy. Let's unpack the mechanics of the newly approved 10,000 crore rupee jet fuel price stabilization fund.
This is a highly sophisticated piece of financial engineering by the government. They're attempting to insulate a hypersensitive infrastructure sector from the immense volatility of global commodity markets.
The context is brutal. Aviation turbine fuel, or ATF, which constitutes roughly half of an airline's total operational expenditure, witnessed a parabolic surge. We saw prices spike from around 60 rupees per liter in early spring to an agonizing 142 rupees per liter by May 2026.
Which is unsustainable.
Completely. If the airlines were forced to absorb that purely through operational cash flow, the sector would face mass insolvency.
So the state engineers a buffer. Now, the term price freeze is a colloquial misnomer.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's not a literal freeze.
No. The government isn't commanding the oil marketing companies. Entities like IOC, BPCL, HPCL to freeze prices and absorb a catastrophic loss. That would destroy their balance sheets. Instead, they establish a dynamic stabilization mechanism.
Let's trace the cash flow for the listener. The government dictates a confidential benchmark price. Let's hypothesize it's 90 rupees per liter.
Okay.
When the global benchmark dictates a price of 142 rupees, the OMCs still sell the fuel to domestic carriers at the artificial 90 rupee benchmark.
But the OMCs are procuring that crude at international rates. They're instantly bleeding 52 rupees on every liter sold.
Right.
This is where the 10,000 crore fund activates. The government provides the OMCs with immediate interest-free financial advances from this fund to explicitly cover that differential. It acts as a massive liquidity bridge.
And the recovery mechanism, because the state isn't running a charity for airline shareholders.
Precisely. The fund is designed as a cyclical stabilization tool. When the geopolitical temperature drops and international crude prices fall below the benchmark, say, down to 70 rupees per liter, the OMCs do not pass that discount on to the airlines. They continue billing at the 90 rupee benchmark. They harvest that 20 rupee delta, use it to replenish their own operational reserves, and aggressively repay the interest-free advances back into the Consolidated Fund of India.
It flattens the volatility curve.
Yeah.
It decapitates the peaks of the price shocks, but it also fills in the valleys, denying the airlines the windfall of cheap fuel during a global glut. They get predictability in exchange for absolute upside potential.
That's the trade-off.
But let's look at the passenger reality. ATF is half an airline's cost. So if I'm booking a flight today, are my flight tickets about to get 30% cheaper?
Because you are analyzing it as a cost-plus pricing model, and aviation doesn't work that way. They utilize advanced dynamic pricing algorithms based on elasticity of demand, load factors, and critical market concentration.
Right.
The cost of fuel dictates the absolute floor of profitability, but market dominance dictates the ceiling of the fare.
And in the Indian domestic market, Indigo commands a staggering market share, hovering around 60%.
It's essentially a monopoly on many routes.
Exactly. When you operate with a near monopoly on high-density routes and a duopoly with the Tata-backed Air India group on others, you don't drop prices out of the goodness of your heart just because your fuel bill was subsidized.
You don't. The airlines will likely absorb the margin expansion to service their legacy debts, finance their massive forward order books for new aircraft, and improve their quarterly yields.
So no cheap tickets.
You might see aggressive fare skirmishes on highly contested routes to defend market share, but on regional thin routes, especially those operating under the UDAN scheme, this stabilization fund primarily prevents route cancellation rather than driving down current fares.
There is also the critical concept of moral hazard that the financial analysts are flagging. In a free market, a well-managed airline protects itself against fuel shocks through sophisticated financial hedging, buying futures contracts to lock in crude prices.
Which costs millions in premiums.
Right. If the government explicitly guarantees to cap your downside risk through a stabilization fund, the economic incentive for an airline to maintain a robust, expensive hedging desk evaporates. The state has effectively become the underwriter of last resort for corporate risk.
And that exposes the sovereign exchequer to immense danger. If the macroeconomic environment shifts, like if the Middle East conflict structurally limits oil supply for the next 3 years, the international price may never drop below the benchmark.
Oh, wow.
The OMCs will exhaust the entire 10,000 crore fund, they will never harvest the cyclical downside to repay it, and the advance metastasizes into a permanent, multi-billion-dollar taxpayer subsidy to a private industry.
It's a high-wire act of economic statecraft. You buffer the market to maintain operational continuity, but you risk trapping sovereign capital. Yeah. Now, we've discussed economic buffering. Let's shift our focus to physical, territorial buffering. Let's analyze the massive structural overhaul of the security architecture on the western frontier.
We are looking at the creation of the new Gujarat border range. This is a profound shift in the command and control doctrine for border policing.
Right. They're moving away from decentralized district-level management to a unified, hyper-focused internal security theater. Following Home Minister Amit Shah's intensive strategic review in Bhuj late this May, the state effectively carved out a unified command structure.
Yes, grouping 3 highly sensitive districts.
Kutch, Patan, and the newly demarcated district of Vavtharad, which was just created in October 2025 under the direct operational control of a specialized inspector general.
The geography dictates the necessity. Gujarat shares a brutal 512-kilometer international boundary with Pakistan.
And a massive percentage of this boundary bisects the Rann of Kutch. The Rann is a logistical paradox. During the dry season, it is a vast, blinding expanse of salt flats, offering zero natural cover but complicating vehicular movement.
And during the monsoon,
tidal shifts and seasonal inundation transform it into an impassable, shallow inland sea. It renders traditional static border fencing highly vulnerable to environmental degradation. And that is just the land border.
You have to factor in the 2,300-kilometer coastline, the longest in the country, deeply indented with creeks and estuaries that blur the maritime boundary.
The threat matrix operating across this terrain has evolved far beyond conventional military infiltration. The primary asymmetric vector right now is narco-terrorism.
The geometry of global narcotics heavily impacts this specific coastline. We are dealing with industrial-scale trafficking syndicates pushing Afghan heroin from the Golden Crescent.
How are they moving it?
They utilize sophisticated maritime drops in international waters, transferring contraband to local dhows, or, increasingly, deploying heavy-lift drones across the land border under the cover of darkness.
And the volume is terrifying. We've seen consecutive multi-thousand-kilogram seizures at commercial hubs like Mundra Port. And the narcotics trade isn't just about localized addiction. It is the financial engine for cross-border terror logistics. The cash is laundered through massive, decentralized hawala networks operating deep within these border districts.
Furthermore, the direct kinetic threat remains acute. The Gujarat Anti-Terrorist Squad has executed a series of high-profile interdictions over the last 36 months, dismantling deeply embedded sleeper cells affiliated with al-Qaeda and the Islamic State Khorasan province.
Which is exactly why the previous highly siloed security apparatus was failing. You had the Border Security Force aggressively patrolling the zero line. You had the Coast Guard monitoring the maritime approaches.
But once they got past that...
Exactly. Once contraband or operatives slipped past that outer perimeter, the responsibility fell to local district police, who are inherently focused on routine law and order, not counterinsurgency.
The new doctrine deployed here is the quadrangular security grid. They're forcing absolute interoperability.
It sounds like they are trying to weave a net with no holes, like bringing everyone from the local cop to the Coast Guard to the bank manager to the same table.
That financial integration is the genius of the new framework.
The bank managers.
Yes. The state recognizes that a sudden, anomalous spike in cash deposits at a rural cooperative bank 5 kilometers from the border is often the most accurate early warning indicator of a successful narcotics drop or a hawala capitalization of a sleeper cell.
So they establish security coordination groups at the district level that pull the local superintendent of police, the BSF commandant, central intelligence operatives, and crucially, financial regulators like the Enforcement Directorate into the same room.
They are enforcing a hypervigilant demographic and financial lockdown on the 0 to 15-kilometer belt along the international border.
And they're backing it up with immense technical capital, employing localized drone swarms, AI-driven optical recognition on the highway networks, and inaugurating new, heavily fortified BSF outposts like G7 and G13.
And we must frame this mobilization against the immediate geopolitical backdrop. Tensions are inherently elevated following Operation Sindoor, the retaliatory precision strikes India executed across the line of control in May 2026.
Right.
In an environment of heightened military friction, you cannot tolerate a porous, financially compromised civilian border immediately adjacent to critical strategic assets like the Bhuj Air Base. Civil-military alignment must be absolute.
You lock down the perimeter to protect the interior. It's a fundamental axiom of security. And that axiom transitions us to our final, most staggering topic. We've discussed securing the physical borders of the state. Let's look at the catastrophic failure to secure the financial borders of the state.
This one is unbelievable.
It is a corporate governance scandal that redefines the scale of regulatory illusion. The SEBI investigation into Rajesh exports.
This is a masterclass in exploiting the jurisdictional limitations of domestic regulatory frameworks through the strategic use of international subsidiaries.
Let's establish the magnitude of the entity we are discussing. Rajesh Mehta's ascent is one of the foundational myths of the post-liberalization Indian economy. He begins in the early 1980s with a minuscule 1,200 rupee loan trading silver jewelry.
1,200 rupees.
Over 4 decades, he relentlessly integrates the entire supply chain. Rajesh Exports Limited becomes a monolithic entity encompassing global mining rights, immense refining capacities, massive domestic manufacturing floors, and a sprawling retail network.
And the inflection point of their global dominance arrived in 2015. REL executed a highly leveraged, incredibly ambitious acquisition of Valcambi SA, headquartered in Switzerland.
Right, Valcambi.
Valcambi is not just a refinery, it is an institution. It is one of the most technologically advanced, highest volume gold refineries on the planet, capable of processing thousands of tons of precious metals annually.
Acquiring Valcambi catapulted REL into the absolute stratosphere of global commodities trading. At their zenith, REL's operations accounted for an astonishing 15% of India's total export value.
Forbes listed Mehta's personal net worth well north of $1 billion.
They were structurally vital to the Indian macroeconomic narrative, which is why the 109-page interim ex parte order issued by SEBI on June 3 is so seismically disruptive.
Following a grueling forensic audit initiated by minor shareholder complaints, SEBI dropped an allegation of revenue misrepresentation that defies basic comprehension.
The figure cited by SEBI is 15.15 lakh crore rupees, over 180 billion US dollars of consolidated revenue reported between the 2020 and 2024 financial years is alleged to be entirely fictitious.
Mind-blowing.
SEBI alleges $180 billion revenue misrepresentation over 4 years. How does a company fake 99.8% of its revenue right under the regulator's nose? I need to understand the mechanics of this, because you don't just invent $180 billion on a spreadsheet without someone noticing the vault is empty. How exactly did they synthesize this revenue?
SEBI outlined several highly complex mechanisms, but the primary engine of the illusion was derivative trade misclassification.
Okay, what does that mean for the listener?
To understand this, you must separate physical commodities from financial contracts. A derivative contract in the gold market is a financial instrument. Two parties agree to bet on the future price of gold. It is settled in cash. No physical gold ever moves. No industrial activity takes place.
Okay, so if I buy a forward contract for a ton of gold, I haven't actually bought gold. I bought a piece of paper.
Exactly. You bought a bet.
Wait, if REL was executing billions of dollars in these paper derivative trades, but their accounting department was classifying the gross notional value of those contracts as physical sales and purchases of actual gold inventory, they were effectively reporting massive industrial trading and refining activity that simply did not exist.
Exactly. They weaponized the gross value of financial derivatives to artificially inflate the top-line revenue of the physical company. It creates the illusion of a corporate leviathan moving thousands of tons of gold across the globe, when in reality, it was just a trading desk swapping financial algorithms.
That is insane. SEBI also flagged direct fund diversion. Hundreds of crores allegedly siphoned into promoter-linked accounts. But the most glaring absurdity is the phantom investments. The balance sheet proudly displayed over 1,000 crore rupees invested in African gold mines.
Ah, yes, the gold mines.
Yet when forensic auditors demanded the title deeds, extraction logs, or even the geographical coordinates of these mines, the company provided absolutely nothing. The asset was a complete vaporware entry.
And the obvious question is, where were the statutory auditors? How does a Big Four or equivalent accounting firm sign off on a balance sheet missing a billion-rupee gold mine and containing $180 billion in misclassified derivatives?
The answer is jurisdictional arbitrage, the overseas subsidiary opacity loophole.
Yes. The sheer genius of the fraud, if the allegations hold, was burying the vast majority of the alleged activity within Valcombi and other global subsidiaries. SEBI noted that an absurd 97 to 99% of REL's total consolidated revenue was generated overseas.
Which means the Indian auditing teams sitting in Bengaluru were completely blind, because they possess zero legal jurisdiction to march into a Swiss refinery protected by draconian Swiss corporate privacy and banking secrecy laws and demand underlying transactional data.
They couldn't verify anything.
They were handed consolidated financial summaries generated by the Swiss entity, and the Indian management essentially stonewalled any requests for granular verification.
SEBI's order explicitly condemns REL for aggressively obstructing the audit process, denying the auditors access to the overseas ledger, and hiding behind the corporate veil of the foreign subsidiaries.
The fallout is nuclear. SEBI has instantly barred Rajesh Mehta and the promoter group from accessing the capital markets or dealing in REL securities. The stock has cratered. They have mandated a multi-year, exhaustive forensic audit. But the regulatory crosshairs are also shifting to the auditors themselves, with a direct referral to the National Financial Reporting Authority, the NFRA.
The institutional damage is immense. The Life Insurance Corporation of India holds nearly an 11% stake in REL.
LIC holds 11%.
Yes. The potential wealth destruction for LIC, which is fundamentally the aggregated premium capital of the Indian middle class, is estimated in the thousands of crores.
But the macroeconomic implications are what truly terrify me. If a single company historically accounted for 15% of India's total exports, and 99% of that company's revenue is now alleged to be a complex accounting fiction, that means the government of India, the RBI, and global sovereign rating agencies have been analyzing, modeling, and making monumental policy decisions based on fundamentally hallucinated export data.
It artificially inflated the GDP metrics, distorted the current account deficit calculations, and projected a narrative of industrial export dominance that was, in part, an algorithmic mirage built in the Swiss Alps.
And the entire house of cards only collapsed. Not because of proactive regulatory surveillance, not because of a sophisticated AI-driven audit by the state, but because a minor shareholder filed a grievance regarding unpaid receivables.
It forces a profound, highly uncomfortable synthesis of everything we've analyzed today.
Let's pull those threads together for you, the listener. We began by dissecting the ashes of an ICU in Bihar, exposing a municipal enforcement apparatus so starved of capacity that it relies on a single inspector for 500,000 lives.
Right.
We navigated the ecological and strategic tightrope of the Great Nicobar megaport, questioning whether sovereign capital is chasing geopolitical ambition at the cost of irreversible environmental destruction.
We examined the atmospheric physics threatening the kharif harvest and the desperate necessity for accurate data currently jeopardized by software failures and administrative rigidity in the hands of 30 lakh exhausted census enumerators.
We unpacked the financial engineering attempting to shield the aviation sector from global fuel shocks, acknowledging the moral hazard of state-backed corporate buffering. We mapped the hypervigilant, unified security architecture deployed across the salt flats of Gujarat to counter the relentless evolution of narco-terrorism.
And finally, we confronted a $180 billion phantom economy hiding behind Swiss corporate secrecy, exposing the terrifying vulnerability of our macroeconomic data sets.
The provocation here is inescapable. The Indian state is moving with breathtaking velocity. We are executing multi-billion-dollar strategic maritime infrastructure. We are digitizing the demographic data of 1 billion citizens. We are projecting global financial power through massive foreign corporate acquisitions. We are building a high-performance 21st century economic engine.
But when you analyze the sheer friction of executing these ambitions, the regulatory blindness, the software failures, the enforcement vacuums, you have to ask, are we mounting this hyper-advanced engine on a fragile, structurally compromised 20th century chassis? Because until the capacity of the state to regulate and enforce catches up with its capacity to envision and build, the friction will continue to spark.
That is the reality of the systems governing our world. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive journey through the data, the mechanisms, and the implications. Keep interrogating the structures around you, keep pulling the threads, and keep elevating your perspective for the UPSC. We will be right back here tomorrow for the next deep dive into the source materials shaping the nation. Take care.